Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
This week, we are bringing a calmer show after our spicy roundtable episode last week, where our guests brought the heat and showed us that partisan politics is alive and well, but most importantly, that we can have fiery conversations that are also respectful on all sides. We are going to start by continuing our election updates and discuss recent breakdown guest Ryan Wilson being tapped as Speaker Lisa Demuth's running mate. Then we are pleased to welcome Darwin Forsyth back to the show. Darwin has previously joined us a number of times, both in his role as communications director at the Minnesota DFL and most recently as spokesperson on Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey's re-election campaign. With Darwin, we will break down all things Minneapolis, from Frey being elected to his third term and the slate running against him, and to where we go from here on the DFL side. Closing things out with a quick update on Krispy Kreme and football. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show. Well, we are officially a week closer to the 2026 election, and with that obviously comes news and info in all of the races, including the governor's race. This week there was some big news. The most recent candidate to jump in, Speaker Lisa Demuth, is the first candidate to announce her running mate. She has chosen Ryan Wilson as her running mate. Ryan was just recently on the podcast as well. He was the 2022 GOP state auditor nominee, came this close, lost by less than a percentage point, the closest that Republicans have come in a statewide race since Tim Pawlenty. He's an attorney, he's a businessman. He is the chair of the new America's First Policy Foundation chapter here in Minnesota. And we had a great conversation with him the other day.
Yeah, I was very impressed. We've had him on, I think we've had him on twice. He had an op-ed, he did an op-ed I'd written an op-ed about why I was supporting Harrison Walz, and he came out with an op-ed opposed to my op-ed, and so we had him on in the interest of discourse. It was a great conversation. And yes, I think he stepped down from AFPI. He was also with the Freedom Club. I don't know the exact title he had with the Freedom Club, but he was also with the Freedom Club. So I think smart, connected, and based on how the closeness of the race in 2022 obviously has some statewide appeal. And so I want to get your take on the naming of it so soon.
I think it's very interesting. I think in recent history, what we've come to see with candidates for governor, at least on the Republican side, is we often get the LG name as we near the convention, which is not until May of the election year. Oftentimes they try to, help boost them heading into that convention, really try to pull some new people in on board that might not already be supporting this, whoever the candidate is, and try to get those delegates on board. So this is earlier than I can remember ever anybody naming it, not even in the election year. I think it's an interesting play. I think it is something, she is, like I said, later on in the race. There's already some other candidates going. She obviously had a lot going on, with the legislative session and then potentially special session. And so this, allows her to also dominate the news cycle for 2 straight weeks with her launch and now the announcement. And I really think it's starting to, she's looking to define herself and what her campaign is going to be, and how she would be in office very quickly. What's your take first on the timing?
Timing of it is interesting. And for those who know me, I used to run a website called Minnesota Democrats Exposed. I also ran a website called politics.mn. And I wrote a lot about the 2014 gubernatorial race and Senate races and statewide races. Something I thought a candidate did very interestingly in 2014, at the time, State Senator Dave Thompson picked State Senator Michelle Benson to be his running mate. And I wrote at the time that the timing of it was early, but it could really benefit the campaign if you have someone who can zigzag across the state, because now you have a campaign that can, in essence, be in 2 places at the same time, which is important. Speaker Demuth is a strong candidate in and of herself. But I think one of the things in the lead up to this, when we've had analysis and roundtables and stuff, Wilson was looked at as one of the candidates that was considered for statewide office on his own right. And it was a candidate that the DFL said that they were kind of the most concerned about. And so him running with Demuth, I think is a very, very strong ticket. The timing of it organizationally, being consistent with what I wrote in the past about this, having a lieutenant governor picked as someone as so high up on the team and running as a ticket, they can now zigzag across the state. They can be in two places at one. While one candidate is at a fundraiser, another can be meeting with delegates and vice versa. So that is a significant organizational asset that the campaign has. Now, that needs to be utilized that way. And so they have a ticket out there. The other advantage that I think it brings is this is something that we've talked about before on the podcast, something that I'm surprised about. Walz is not named a running mate yet. And so here we are less than 1 year out before the election. And the Demuth-Wilson ticket is out there presenting itself to the state. And people don't vote. This is what, we discussed this greatly during the presidential race, that people don't vote based on who the VP is. And people may not vote based on who the running mate is. But I will tell you, one of the things that I said a year ago, I think still holds up true, is that because of the advent of social media, because voters have so much more information, there is an opportunity for voters. I think they got to know who Walz was. And I think that the voters are going to get an opportunity to know who these running mates are, which I think makes the pick more significant. And so historically, it may not be as relevant who a running mate is. But I think Wilson is immensely qualified. I think complements the leadership that Speaker Demuth has. And I will tell you, not to age myself a bit, but I thought that the rollout was very old school. And I liked that. They had, I think they had Capitol press conferences, which I like to see. They're out there traveling the state. They're doing the fly arounds. They're doing that kind of old school stuff that I know I did. And Becky, certainly not saying you're old, but I think you did too.
Oh, yeah.
And so from that operations standpoint, I see a campaign that's running uniquely different because they're doing, I think, a lot of the nuts and bolts. Now, in the interest of full transparency, I don't think either of us are supporting anyone at this point. I'm certainly not, and not working on any campaigns. So our analysis is what it is. But I will also say, to a point you made, they have, I think, very successfully sucked a lot of the oxygen away from any other campaign right now. And that's just my balls and strikes analysis. Take it for what it's worth. But I think the rollout was pretty much as good as it can get. And seeing some of the old school tactics, the press conferences, standing in front of the press, pulling off a statewide tour, that's the type of stuff I used to do. And you've obviously done it. And it's good to see old things coming back as being new.
Absolutely. It's some criticism that I've had of recent campaigns of not doing some of those things, which are, yes, old school, but also they work, right? I mean, there is an opportunity then to get into those local and community papers to hold events around the state. And like you mentioned, now they have twice the ability to do so, especially as we're getting near the legislative session, which we know Speaker Demuth is going to, have a little bit more time tied up in than some of the other candidates. So Ryan is going to have the opportunity to continue to be out on the road at the time. Curious your thoughts on whether this pressures other candidates. Do you expect that by the end of the year, we will see other candidates come out with their lieutenant governor pick? And in particular, do you think that Walz not coming out and, maybe look at this objectively and not as a former Walz supporter, but do you think the longer he waits now, I will say the longer he waits now, to me, it feels like, can he not find somebody that wants to run with him or willing to stand by him for a third term? Because that's kind of what I'm feeling. I mean, I understand why he was waiting through the summer. He was waiting for his announcement. But now the more weeks that pass, that's the vibe I'm getting from that, and a narrative that I think other campaigns can use.
So in prep for our episode and that loaded question, which I expected, Walz picked Flanagan in October of 2017. Help me with the calendar. So Wilson was picked this week.
November, yeah.
So November. So relatively the same time schedule. I think that benefits them. Yes, it puts pressure on them. Again,
he's the incumbent, so
yes,
right?
And so yes, I have been saying for a while, well before the announcement by Demuth that she was selecting Wilson, I have thought that Walz has needed to pick a running mate. And in conversations I've said on this podcast, or things I've said in this podcast and with others on the phone, the fact that the governor has not yet named a running mate, I think is a story that needs to be discussed and hammered more. The fact that Speaker Demuth, was able to get someone who was considered a statewide candidate on his own to be the running mate, I think is a testament to her leadership and her capabilities. And we've had her on, I think, twice on the podcast, once in person. And so I was observing the events of the last couple of weeks just as a voter, and I was very impressed. There's other candidates that I've been impressed by their approaches. I mentioned, Scott Jensen last week for his rollout to classrooms and meeting with students. And, we've spoken to Representative Robbins for her work on the fraud committee and her messaging. There is a real buzz of activity right now. I think Republicans, are stepping up. I will say again, just straight balls and strikes, that the manner of the rollout of Demuth and then Wilson, I think shows me that is a campaign that is doing things different than campaigns have been done in the past. A friend of mine, Mark Drake, would frequently say, Michael, these aren't real campaigns in Minnesota. And he has been spot on. And the first indication that I've seen of that has been this cycle. I think there's been a couple campaigns that have stepped up and are doing things better, but certainly Demuth selecting Wilson not only shows organizational strength, it shows that the campaign is ready to lead on day one, but it absolutely puts pressure, I think, and reinforces a story that I think should be discussed more, which is the fact that Governor Walz does not have a running mate yet.
Absolutely. I am very interested also to see if other Republican candidates, if this kind of pushes them along. I know always you're having conversations and trying to look at who, is out there, and they're probably already, having a short list. In my experience, working on some launches and that, those lists are ever evolving. Those conversations are being had. But it wouldn't surprise me if we see one or two other LG candidates announced here before the end of the year. But real quick, before we wrap on this one, I want to just get the one thing we know that Democrats are going to do for any candidate, regardless who they are try to tie them to President Trump and the chaos in Washington and the far right of the Republican Party. This ticket, I think, does its best to kind of show that that's not, I mean, obviously they're Republicans, but they're a very steady hand, policy focused ticket. I think it's an advantage that they have coming. Do you think, in advance of the convention being part of this and the endorsement, does it surprise you that candidates, with Demuth not being necessarily a far right wing candidate, do you expect sometimes that she would pick somebody a little bit more right wing, or does this not surprise you in that sense?
First of all, I consider Demuth to be a first round draft pick to run statewide. And I think Wilson is a first round pick. I mean, I think that I agree. I think it's a very, very strong ticket. I think that they have one thing I've noticed about, and I've tried to pay more attention over the last week. And again, we've had them both on the podcast, but Wilson when we've had him on, it's always been somewhat of a policy discussion. And obviously his policies reflect leadership that he sees in President Trump, and Demuth in the same way. I view them looking at the support of President Trump from the policy standpoint. And I think that's where I think the debate can happen. I
Absolutely.
think we should talk more on the podcast, discuss the role of Trump in Minnesota politics. But I think that they're threading that needle in a very responsive way. And it's going to be very fascinating to see how that campaign continues to message on that, because one of the things that we discussed and the Democrats mentioned when we've had them on talking about Wilson is that they know he's MAGA, but he doesn't wave it that way. And
Right.
And I don't think Speaker Demuth waves it that way. And so to see them campaigning as who they are as individuals and as leaders, I think one of the advantages that both of them have is they have policy chops. That they have, Wilson was obviously the speaker in her own capacity, being the head of the Speaker of the House and helping steer and lead on policy is significant. But Wilson's op-eds, his commentary, and some of the leadership positions he's taken in organizations in this state have been policy focused. And so aside from being helpful in ensuring that the president wins nationally and the JD and vice president wins. So I think they bring a balanced approach and an electable balanced approach. And it's something I think we should talk about more. But my overall grade is a solid A for the rollout and the announcements and the fact that they have a unified team.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, I am really excited for some of the messaging that I think is going to come out of these gubernatorial campaigns this year. I think it's going to be next level, something we haven't seen in a while. And you know how much I love messaging from Republicans and have been craving that. So looking forward to it, and it's going to be a fun cycle. One of the other things that I think comes from this is kind of that balance. Obviously, Ryan Wilson has name ID, something you always like to look to bring to the ticket. Not something we're always going to see from some of these candidates, but we also have a little bit of kind of that rural, suburban aspect. I think the demographic is something that we always want to see. If you're going to, you kind of got to look at all of it, the gender of it, the demographics of it, the age of it, the background. And I think there's a really good kind of yin and yang for this ticket with that. Your thoughts? I mean, great, right?
Absolutely. I have, worked on a few gubernatorial campaigns and was helpful in a couple of them in going through kind of the vetting process and the selection of running mates. And it's something that I'm interested in. When I heard about the possibility of this happening, as it was kind of building on social media and others that were reporting it, it really was, if you're looking to, I've always been an advocate for having there being balance on the ticket. And if it's a male candidate running, female lieutenant governor, and vice versa, that checks that box. Rural, she's from Cold Spring. Up in Stearns County. He's from Maple Grove. So there's some balance there. They different racial and ethnic backgrounds, I think is significant. She is the first female African-American speaker of the Minnesota House of Representatives. That is historic. That is significant. And then, Wilson, his background, they have a lot of contrast, both personally and professionally. There's a lot of contrast, all of which I think builds and complements each other. And I think ultimately, and that's been my logic when I was first working on campaigns, when you make these types of picks, I don't know the thought process that Speaker Demuth had, but if you're looking to have the campaign be as inviting as it can be and inviting to people from all different walks of lives and backgrounds, this ticket does that. I'm
going to put you on the spot here. Obviously, again, we're not involved in any of these conversations or campaigns. Are there any other names you hear floating out for other candidates or if you were involved in a campaign that you would put on a short list? For some of the others, we've got Jensen, we've got Kendall Qualls, we've got Kristen Robbins. Any thoughts of, or just the type of person they should look for?
Here is the thing I think that's occurred. They've just set the market with Wilson. They've set a bar. And I've been impressed by the limited interactions that we've had him on the podcast, the depth of his policy understanding, his approach, his background, who he is, and obviously I've seen more of the last week. Demuth made a leadership decision, and she set the market with that decision, meaning she just raised the bar. And so the fact that, first of all, that is a huge compliment to her leadership, that she was able to get someone to run with her and be a running mate who was considered statewide candidate in his own right and is going to play what I would call a supporting role in making sure that she gets elected. But if you look at Wilson's qualifications, she set the market. And what I mean by that is she just raised the bar. And so everyone now will be judged in the shadow of Ryan Wilson's pedigree and his background and his qualifications. And that's a high bar. And so I will just say, not to sound like I'm from the office and I'm talking Michael Scott here. There's not a Ryan Wilson tree. There's not a Stanley tree. And so the question is, you got to find someone of that pedigree and qualifications. And that's going to be very interesting for those campaigns to do. Again, I think Speaker Demuth has made a very bold leadership decision. She has, I think, raised the bar both for the governor and for her colleagues the other people that are running, her competitors, to see if they can match that type of balanced ticket, because it is a strong ticket.
Love it. It's going to be a lot of conversation yet in the next year to come. So it's exciting.
And we'll be here to cover it all, every little morsel.
We are excited to have Darwin back on the show today. Darwin, it's been a big couple of weeks for you, most recently in your role over on Jacob Frey's mayoral re-election campaign. Let's just start with election night, and we'll chat all the nitty-gritty moving up to it, but talk to us about election night. How was the vibe as things were, the results were rolling in and coming out to your eventual success and victory?
Well, election night was obviously great, way better than if the shoe had been on the other foot. But one
Or
thing
a Republican.
that is true. Well, yes, actually, yes. I think Republicans were probably sad about the election results in Minneapolis for their own 2026 prospects. But one thing that was a little weird this year was that in past years they've included the total second and third choice votes for candidates when they release the results for Minneapolis mayor and other municipal elections in Minneapolis, but this year they did not. So we knew we had a comfortable lead. We knew that if we hit 40%, we'd be in pretty good shape. One thing that's helped us make it clear that we were going to win in 2017 or 2021 is that in addition to leading with first choice votes, Jacob Frey also held a lead with second choice votes, for example. So that was a little murkier than we would have liked this year, but our crew of goblins did go to the ticker tape at many polling stations, and they got enough. You can see the second and third choice votes on the stringers, so it was clear that unless something very, very weird was happening in the other 60% precincts where we didn't have people, then we were going to be in okay shape. So it was, we knew we were in good shape on election night. We did a little bit of analysis, and then we felt comfortable giving the cautiously optimistic, things are looking good speech at the end of the election night.
Why was that number not, if it had been released in the past, do you have any idea as to why they broke with protocol?
You should ask friend of the show, Secretary Steve Simon, or I actually have no idea if it's the choice made by the Secretary of State or the city clerk's office or the county, so I shouldn't point the finger at a boss who's been very good to me in the past as a very good Secretary of State. But no, whatever change was made, I had big thumbs down from this guy and from probably political reporters everywhere who were looking for tea leaves on election night.
Did you know going into election night that you were not going to get that information?
No, that was a little November surprise for all of us.
Ooh, I can only imagine how that messed with your heads. You're going into it. You have your plan of attack of where you need votes and what you need on the first and what you need on the second. I'm sure it was a little nerve-wracking for you all.
A little, but we knew that if we got over 40%, that based off historical analysis of how second and third choice votes roll up, that there was pretty much no path for us to lose. So we felt confident enough going into the next morning that we were able to start planning for one speech versus the other speech.
So obviously we know things were a little bit different across the river for you guys. So congratulations that it was definitely a big night across the board. I'm not super well versed in ranked choice voting. How does that kind of strategy play into how you go, especially when you have kind of this slate of candidates running against the mayor? How do you work an angle for that second vote from folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So with us, it was always a matter of trying to get, particularly as a two-term incumbent who has been with 100% name recognition and with a very balkanized opinion. For us, it was about getting as many first choice votes as possible because we knew that on the whole, second and third choice votes, if we came down with like 35% of it, that meant that most of those were not going to go our way. I think it was also about like making the case to voters strongly enough that we knew we would get some of those second and third choice votes, particularly Jazz Hampton voters. We obviously were in a position where we had a comfortable amount of resources, but I'm not quite sure why the Davis and Hampton campaigns made the decision to ticket up with Fate. I understand why the Fate campaign made that decision. I think that decision was smart for Fate, but it also created an environment where we knew, for example, that most Hampton voters were going to break our way if, as everyone knew it would, it came down to Fate and Frey. And I think it's impossible to say without some more scientific analysis. I think it probably made it harder for Hampton to break through with people who might have been open to ranking him first by ticking it up with someone that a lot of the city found unpalatable. And so I think the key strategy for us was just making sure we ran our campaign, got as many first choices we can, didn't let this slate for change thing get in our heads too much here. I mean, for us, people do make decisions based off who their first choice is, but like they're not very loyal to who a candidate tells them to rank second and third, as we saw down the ballot, even with Davis voters.
Darwin, do you think, having worked on a few elections in Minneapolis, do you think ranked choice voting works and makes sense? Or what's your pro con for it as a voting method?
I think that there are good arguments on either sides. I actually think, and this is probably the least popular opinion in Minnesota politics, that it makes more sense for partisan races than for partisan general elections than for nonpartisan municipals. I think that it kind of makes sense to me if you are a Green Party voter that you might want your vote to transfer to the Democratic nominee if that candidate doesn't win, or that if you're a Constitution Party or Libertarian voter, a little iffy on that one, that you probably want your vote to transfer to the Republican candidate. I think it gets a little murkier when you have, despite what rhetoric might tell you, largely ideologically similar candidates in municipal elections with lower visibility, lower name recognition. I think it probably benefits incumbents a fair amount. I will say, though, there have been some city elections where I think on the whole, like, you would have had a spoiler effect without it. I think Andrea Jenkins, for example, would have lost in 2023 to the DSA candidate without ranked choice voting. A similar candidate on the other end of the spectrum would have won in the 3rd Ward in Minneapolis in 2017 without ranked choice voting. So I do think there have been some instances where you would have had a situation where there would have been a spoiler effect, or candidates would have had to triage, okay, am I going to drop out of the race to make room for this other candidate? And so I am also very sympathetic, though, to the argument. It's not super easy to understand. It's, the way that Minneapolis does it in particular, like, can be really weird if one candidate who's in second place, I'm not even going to get into this, but like, there was a weird situation in 2021 where the second place candidate was automatically eliminated. I think that should be fixed for future elections. I don't think it makes sense. I did a stint in the Secretary of State's office. I don't think it makes sense to take it statewide in Minnesota right now. I think that's ever going to be a conversation. It's the kind of thing where more people have to get used to it, more people have to understand how it works, and also the elections officials have to catch up to it and figure out how it works. We're still doing that here in Minneapolis. We've had it for 3 elections, so not to cop out.
Thank you for making that clear.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So not to cop out too much here, but I do think there are both pros in terms of avoiding the spoiler effect somewhat, but also I think elections should be simpler and easier for people to understand. And the second that you start making people doing like transfers in their head, that does get a little messy.
As we come out of elections, we always kind of like to look at what voters were thinking and what they think moving forward. What message do you think that voters were trying to send here about Mayor Frey, about his first 2 terms, and about where Minneapolis is headed in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the first time that Mayor Frey has ever run citywide and won with a ultimate majority of votes, where a majority of people ranked him, and he ended up receiving over 50% of the vote in a general election. In 2021, the final result was like 49-38, which showed that a lot of people were not willing to rank either of the two final candidates. That didn't happen here. I think that no one, including the mayor, would say he's been a perfect mayor, but I think people are also understand that mayors, and especially the mayor of Minneapolis, that's not an easy job between the years of 2020 and 2025. And I think that people understand he was dealt a tough hand, and there are a lot of other cities where maybe the comeback or recovery has been more stilted or stagnant, and a sort of limping effect there that you're not seeing as much in Minneapolis. There are definitely things that need to get better. Plenty of, like Minneapolis is like many other cities that need to get back to where they were pre-pandemic on a lot of stuff. But I think that people fundamentally believe that the mayor's pragmatic progressive lane is the right way to do it, and that we shouldn't overcorrect for the challenges that we're seeing either here or nationally by embracing ideas that sound good but don't work. And I'll leave it there.
Great. We saw this time a pretty big shift in kind of some of the DFL base in Minneapolis, and obviously the mayor's race or campaign had to go up against that progressive DSA side, the moderate side, those pragmatic Democrats where kind of his bread and butter is. And we've seen a lot, just within the Minneapolis DFL and the local party unit, and some people trying to move, saying you can't be both endorsed by the DSA and the DFL. So how do you think that going forward, if you had a crystal ball, how does the DSA and the DFL commingle, and how does that, what's the role of the DSA within the DFL? Is there a role? Is it going to be wholly siloed off, or what are your thoughts on that?
So let me start by saying that I genuinely do, despite what many critics might have you believe, I genuinely do believe the DFL should be a big tent party. I think that we can accommodate some of those like farther leftist wing of the party. Setting aside the label of DSA for a moment, I think where we run into problems is the both caucus convention process and the local party unit process in cities where we have overwhelmingly Democratic voters, Democratic representation. It's a question of which Democrat will win, not whether a Democrat will win. At that point, when you get beyond competitive Senate districts, competitive House districts, statewide races, at that point, local party units like the Minneapolis DFL don't become a vehicle for electing Democrats or defeating Republicans. They become a vehicle for litigating intra-party fights and handing the parties weight, seal of approval, resources, and the value of bearing their seal of approval to your favored faction. I don't think that anyone would argue that that's not true. There are plenty of people who would argue that's serving the party well, but I don't think it does serve statewide Democrats well. I think it's a really good vehicle for the most ideological wing of the party to capture a vehicle for electing their own candidates. But I think we should disabuse ourselves of the idea that it's about winning Democratic versus Republican elections at this point. Democrats are not turning out because of the Minneapolis DFL party unit. Democrats are turning out because of the massive coordinated campaign. Democrats are turning out because Amy Klobuchar or Angie Craig or Peggy Flanagan are going to have a massive machine of organized voters behind them showing up to vote. They're not turning out because every 4 years people get in a room and decided that Omar Fateh is their preferred candidate who should carry the Democratic Party label of approval. I think that what we've seen happen to your party, frankly, Becky, and your party, Michael, is a warning sign for us. We can keep going down a route where we empower an increasingly unrepresentative group of people, where we exhaust and burn out the normies in our party over and over again until they fully cede those institutions to the most extreme wing of our party. And then we just pray and hope that Republicans keep screwing up so badly that it doesn't cost us elections, which has been an okay strategy, but at some point, I'm of the belief that you guys are going to get your act together.
One can hope. But you took the words out of my mouth. I mean, as you're kind of talking about the factions taking over and the party, statewide not meant to appease those factions, and so that's not how you serve the party. That's what one of our main issues in the Republican Party of Minnesota is that's exactly what has happened. And so now I need you to give us advice and also what you see with the DFL going forward, because I feel like, for example, with Chair Han, we tried to kind of institute somebody who is going to be that train conductor and police officer of trying to get things back on track. And we're focused on winning elections, not, making the party platform exactly what we need and ensuring our legislators adhere to that. Unfortunately, that has not been super successful, even still, for the Republican Party. So, we know that they're at the DFL, your former employer, there has been a shift over there with a new chairman. Do you see what's going on in Minneapolis kind of being at play within the DFL as a whole, as a statewide, to kind of figure out how to navigate those different factions with your party? Because, again, as a Republican side of things, I love to see the division on the left that we haven't seen so publicly and so blatantly. This is the first time I can remember in the last 15 plus years that I've been involved in partisan politics that we see those cracks and frustrations within the different factions a little bit more. So do you have a path forward of how the party, is that something Mayor Frey is going to work on on the campaign side, obviously not official side? Is that something that the party as a whole kind of gets into, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely something that we have to decide as a party, both institutionally, the institution of the Minnesota DFL state party, and also as voters, how we want to approach this dichotomy here. I think that to give you an example here, when David Han lost, which none of us at HQ really saw coming, we were thrilled. I mean, like, I agreed with David Han on nothing, but he was fundamentally, like, he had a really tough position, but he was fundamentally okay at, doing a really hard job with very limited resources and getting stuff done in a way that I thought was about as effective as anyone in that hollowed out institution could be. And the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, do we want to go down that road? I won't speak for what Mayor Frey's plans are on that route, but I absolutely think that we as a party need to have a conversation about whether or not the caucus and convention process is really going to serve our party. It become extremely personal, extremely vitriolic, and they also do empower a section of the party that is not representative of the electorate as a whole. The DFL endorsement has not produced a candidate for governor in a contested primary in longer than I've been alive, for sure. Maybe longer than Michael's been alive. Definitely longer than both of you can vote, I think.
Yep.
And I don't think that's an accident. And we have to ask ourselves what happens when we end up in a situation where, like, our Scott Jensen wins a statewide endorsement, and we just hope that actual Scott Jensen is the Republican nominee again. In the past, we've seen outside Minnesota, when we put up our weak candidates and Republicans put up their weak candidates sometimes win. And I think we have this sense of invulnerability here in Minnesota, and also the reality that the factions that are empowered by the caucus and convention process aren't going to give it up easily. So at a certain point, people who matter more than me are going to have to decide what, when, and how to resolve that issue.
Darwin, when I was when I was more partisan, I used to frequently say that I love the smell of DFL infighting in the morning. I don't subscribe to that as much these days, or any level of infighting. But I will say to you, as Becky and I did, Becky lives in the suburbs and I live in the suburbs, watching what was going on in Minneapolis, one of the points that we made, and we had some great guests on the show talk about this, one of the challenges was going to be that I think Minneapolis, for lack of a better phrase, really dodged a bullet here. And probably not the best example, but I just wanted to say, in speaking with some business leaders and some of the guests we had on our show, the rise of the DSA, the challenge, and one of the things that Becky and I discussed was when Republicans don't win elections in a city, and the last Republican legislator in the city of Minneapolis was, drumroll, former Governor Arnie Carlson, was the last Republican legislator in the city of Minneapolis. And so the DFL is dominated in that city. And what that creates is a faction, that creates an opportunity for a faction. And that is not a problem that Republicans have right now, because the factions that Republicans have are limited in their geographic space, because Republicans don't win elections to the same degree as which Democrats do. Republicans don't control a city, the city levers, like the Democrats do with the DFL. And so the stakes are higher. That was the point I was eventually getting to, is that, and we as Republicans, whether we live in the suburbs, Minneapolis, or all Minnesotans, should want to make sure that Minneapolis succeeds. Because when Minneapolis succeeds, the rest of the state succeeds. Explain to our listeners how the composition of the city council has changed in a way that Mayor Frey's third term will he have more or less partners in city council to help bring some additional leadership partnerships to change in Minneapolis?
He will definitely have more, which is another positive reflection of the election results. We flipped, I believe, 3 council seats in our favor and only lost 1. So we should have at least enough to sustain a veto, perhaps enough to cobble together a governing majority on the city council even. But I think that one undercovered dynamic, there's a lot of talk about infighting at City Hall and division and vetoes, that didn't really ramp up until after the 2023 city council elections, when they were able to get enough votes on the DSA friendly or DSA adjacent side of the city council to override mayoral vetoes. That didn't become a thing that happened regularly until they realized, we could figure out something where the mayor's okay with it, get 85% of what we want to, and move forward. It's like, nah, rather than get 14 policymakers all on the same page, let's get 9 on the same page and get 100% of what we want rather than 85% of what we want. I think a great example is the Uber Lyft bill that was preempted by a DFL legislature and a DFL governor. Like Mayor Frey proposed, I believe it was a 14% pay increase for Uber and Lyft drivers in Minneapolis. City Council said no, we're moving forward with this version. The state came back and said we can't actually afford to lose rideshare services altogether. That doesn't make sense for drivers or riders or anyone. And instituted a 14% increase, identical to what the mayor proposed. So that's a long way of saying that with the shift on the city council, I think you're going to see, by necessity, not necessarily because of better angels, but you're just not going to be able to get an ordinance through past the mayor without folks meeting each other halfway.
I just wanted to piggyback on one thing you said and just note, I think it's important that we get a time after the elections to analyze and discuss some things. But the one thing I do want to echo very significantly is that Republicans should take a bit of stock in how quickly the DFL cleaned up some of their problems and was able to maneuver it. Boy, oh boy, that would be better if Republicans adopt some of those plans. And I think Democrats should see to the degree at which what infighting can actually produce. And I think it's fair to say that if this isn't cauterized and dealt with a little bit in Minneapolis, it could have some statewide implications.
I couldn't agree more. I will give a lot of folks credit when the Minneapolis convention results, to warm welcome from Minneapolis Twitter, appeared on this podcast immediately following the DFL convention, where, what I said on the podcast, what I said on the convention floor, what I said in press releases and days and hours to follow was that we literally didn't do a good job of counting votes. We didn't count a significant portion of the votes at the convention. And not only was all of that later proven to be true, despite claims to the contrary at the time, but it dropped a candidate who should not have been dropped from after the first ballot, which everyone in this conversation knows how consequential that is. And there was a
That's
lot of
bad.
chagrin when, yes, correct. That is not good for those watching at home. But there was a lot of chagrin when the state party corrected that mistake and revoked the endorsement issued on that result. It was a historic decision. It was also a historic screw up. And I don't know that you would have seen the same sort of remedy if this were on the Republican side, or if you had, like, I don't even want to know what the consequences would have been if you'd had some sort of, I'll say with Otter Tail County is a great example.
Yes.
Way less high profile, way less consequential at the end of the day, but that cost David Han his job. I don't think we're going to see the same thing on the DFL side here, but it is a contrast that I'm grateful for, and that I think as Democrats we should want to hold on to.
Correct. And Republicans don't have the levers, the same tools in the toolbox the Democrats had. That's another example of how they're one step ahead of Republicans, because they have a vehicle in place to deal and address with these inter-party fights before they metastasize into larger problems.
Exactly. Like, we have institutions where campaigns can file these appeals. Most of the time, they don't amount to anything because there is a sour grapes element. That's not what happened here, historic situation, but it is very useful to have that tool in the event there is truly a consequential for the party, for the people being represented, when they're disenfranchised by a process like that. And I'm grateful that we're ahead of the curve on that.
I would say it's almost, the Republican Party is almost, 5-10 years down the line of what could happen if the DSA side of the world kind of infiltrates and takes over a little bit more. Not saying that we have some great activists and great delegates and great party officers in the party. Just 5 years ago myself, I was executive director of the Republican Party of Minnesota. I know a lot of these folks. There are a lot of great folks. But it is a kind of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and that's what's happened on our side, as we have those folks that when you have a chair like Han or others that try to step in and right size things a little bit, they are overthrown. And so major more power to you, and well wishes in your endeavors, because I don't necessarily think that this is going to go away. I think that we will probably still see things, but obviously because you have a better functioning party unit as a whole, it does appear that hopefully for your side of things will be a little bit more smooth sailing than we've had on the right. I do want to bring it real quick back to this specific campaign. And one thing that we had talked about last week is we gave a little credit to Mayor Carter and how he handled his defeat, applauding and congratulating Mayor-elect her on Twitter, phone calls and the like. And at that time, so this, a week ago, just days after the election, we talked about how Mayor Frey had heard from Hampton and Davis, but at that point had not heard from Fate. Has that changed? Has the mayor gotten a call from his opponent, or anything that you can share with us on that?
As of Friday or Saturday, when I last checked in with the mayor about this, he had not gotten that call yet. So maybe he's gotten one in the last few days. I did stop asking after 48 or 72 hours. I think it's a fair assumption that call has not come in yet. Maybe Fate will watch this and post a screen cap showing otherwise, but I don't think that someone changes their mind after 3 or 4 days and decides to call the winner.
I do think he is an avid listener of the breakdown, so it would not be
Yes,
surprised
I'm
if he
sure.
corrects a record of that.
Exactly. But no, and I do think that we don't need to relitigate this too much, but I do think it shows an asymmetry in DFL politics in terms of norms, discourse, etc. You know, there's a difference between criticizing your opponent, criticizing an opposing campaign for being wrong on the issues versus refusing to concede after an election's been called. I think it's another warning sign and a parallel that we don't necessarily want to emulate from the other side.
You're correct. Darwin, I just want to say, you've been on the podcast a number of times and you've thrown a lot of heat. You've pushed back on both Becky and I and some of our guests. You took some heat the last time you were on. And I just want to say thank you for being willing to come on and talk with us. We disagree on a lot of things, and you've certainly disagreed with us on a number of things, but you're always welcomed here. And I appreciate your willingness to come on with a couple of Republicans, maybe a name only, that don't live in those areas, but are willing to come on and have those discussions. We need more of that in politics. And the heat that you took was certainly noticed on my part. But I do appreciate willingness to come back on, and you're always welcome to come back on and tell Becky why she's wrong.
Yeah, of course. And if I might just jump into that, the head of the Democratic Party has been on this podcast. The DFL Secretary of State has been on this podcast. The former DFL House Majority Leader has been on this podcast. Between the three people on this call, there were 2 votes for Kamala Harris and 1 vote for none of the above, more or less. If we're at a point, and this doesn't surprise me based off my past experience with Minneapolis Twitter, where it makes me a fascist or MAGA January 6er, those are real terms that were used to describe me.
Wow.
It's funny for those of you who have exposure to actual Republican politics, just how wildly un-MAGA a guy whose career has been exclusively electing Democrats at the expense of Republicans, who was born on tax day in Washington, D.C., and is named Darwin. The idea that that makes me on the right of the political spectrum, let alone the far right of the political spectrum, is silly and ridiculous. I think that kind of thinking and trying to convince people that they are impure or cancelable for disagreeing with folks on far leftist orthodoxy beyond standard progressive liberalism is part of the reason why we've struggled to win elections, even as demographics that would have been extremely favorable to us 15 years ago have now shifted dramatically against us. And I think the more that we try to convince people that Jacob Frey is a right-wing fascist, the more that you're going to find people who do support normie Democrats or who don't support DSAers are going to say, okay, if you're telling me over and over again that I don't have a home in this party, at some point they're just going to start to say, okay, if you insist, if you don't want me in the coalition, I'm out.
Yep. Well said.
Well said indeed.
Darwin, thank you so much. And we hope to have you back on soon.
Thank you both for having me on. I'll always happy to join, and I'll make sure to tweet about it every time that we do,
Perfect.
Just for the positive engagement.
That's right. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, folks.
Have a good one. Congratulations again.
Thank you.
Becky, we just finished an interview with Darwin Forsyth, who worked for Mayor Frey's victorious campaign in the city of Lake City, Minneapolis. Your take on the interview?
Darwin's been on a number of times, and I always love somebody who Darwin and I were on the opposite sides of the world for a while, not necessarily somebody who I expected to have so many long conversations with about politics and find agreement. But I love that he is willing to come on the show. I think having good conversations and really getting that insight into that campaign. I've, been on some wild and crazy campaigns myself, but this one I think is just has so many unique dynamics that we haven't seen before, with that kind of the DSA component and the infighting and the Slate or Alliance running against him, the ranked choice voting, which is just my brain hurts trying to think of how to navigate that from a strategy perspective. And they had so much going up against them, so many different campaigns around the country that we've seen go against kind of that pragmatic Democrat this cycle, and Mayor Frey came out victorious. And so we know Darwin's an expert communicator and a great strategist, and congratulations to him, and I'm excited that he was able to come on and give us a little insight into how things went.
Yes, he's incredibly smart. He also doesn't pull any of his punches. I have, one of the things, and I've seen some of the criticism of him coming on. This podcast is I think is pretty much as, for a couple of homeless Republicans, we work very hard to bring on guests of all political backgrounds. And Darwin has always been someone who has been approachable, respectful, but he comes on as who he is. And I don't think we've ever gotten a diet or watered down version of Darwin. He's a passionate Democrat. He is a very talented and smart Democrat. And if you're a podcast with a couple of co-hosts who want to have smart guests on, Darwin's is in your Rolodex and someone to call, and always appreciative of his time and willingness to come on. And he does a very good job of explaining the political process, but also representing the Democrats on a variety of issues. And that's one of the reasons we have him on. And so to the critics out there, I would just say, be more like Darwin. Just be more like him. And what I mean by that is, I don't think we bring any guest on we want people to come on and be themselves.
Yeah.
We don't have an agenda or a script or say to people, we bring people on who we think will elevate the discussion, be respectful, but simultaneously also be who they are. Darwin fits that mold, and I think he's been a great ambassador for DFL politics, DFL candidates, and understanding the party process. And I'm thankful that he has taken some heat, but is still willing to come back into the kitchen with us.
And I gotta say, I was surprised when you mentioned, I didn't know he took so much heat from coming on before. Like he mentioned, we have literally had Secretary of State Steve Simon, we've had former Congressman Dean Phillips, we've had Lee Finke, we've had Zach Stevenson, we've had Ken Martin. I mean, these are not lightweight Democrats that have joined our show. And I don't think ever have we had a conversation with Democrats with a MAGA lens, right? Like yes, we talk about it in conjunction, but it's just very clearly the attacks were coming from people who don't listen to our show, because these folks I don't think would come on our show if that's the case. So
in fact, if I may, I don't mean to interrupt, but in fact, we do a good job, since I don't think either of us necessarily traffic in the MAGA lane. We do a good job of bringing people on who represent that, so we can ensure that we're providing a balanced perspective. Nearly every podcast, we have someone comes on that disagrees with us. And so that's the whole point of having these discussions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for getting it. It was a great conversation. I'm excited to see where he goes after this, but certainly not the last we've heard from Darwin. And congratulations to him and Team Frey, and on to 2026.
Yeah, well, I'm pissed, and I'll explain why I'm pissed.
Why you're pissed?
Because Krispy Kreme opened yesterday, and I haven't been there yet.
You haven't been there?
I haven't been there yet. And first of all, a couple complications in the plan. Number one, they opened at 8:00 in the morning. I was under the belief they were going to open up sooner. They opened up at 8:00, and I expected to have a little bit of support structure with me. But apparently, those who shall be named nameless don't think it's appropriate to pull kids out of school for waiting in line for donuts. And so my hope is to go tonight. And so I'm frustrated, but yet still motivated to go. I'm going to hopefully go tonight. The one thing I will say is I later learned that the people at the front of the line. So it opened yesterday in Friendly Fridley at 8 a.m. The people at the front of the line got in line at noon on Tuesday. So they were in line almost, 20 some hours in advance. Those are patriots. Those are the people that we need to be remembering. And I hope that we remember those souls, those people that stood there bravely in those lines, and they're memorialized in some way in the history of Krispy Kreme, maybe with a statue outside or something. But that could have been me. But I hope to have some of that deliciousness yet today.
Is there anything you like enough to be there 24 hours in advance to wait in line?
Yeah, probably. I mean, if I would have thought about it, the other plan that was discussed is Krispy Kreme is outside of the range of DoorDash. I looked last night. Your address can accept them. So there was a lot of discussion about, well, can't we just DoorDash them to her house and then we drive and pick them up? But
You
we can
absolutely
discuss that arrangement. There'll be a finder's fee of some sort, as long as that's possible. But no, I would wait in line. I've waited in line for a number of things. But I was a little bit earlier in the morning. It was a 2-hour wait. And again, I can't compete. I got a job. Not to say other people don't, but there's school drop off. There's other things. And getting there that far in advance, I just can't do that.
Well, I expect a full rundown next week, a full breakdown, if you will, next week on how it goes. I do hear there were, at least, I don't know if it's a full-time thing or just if for the meantime, there's an express lane for those who are just getting a simple dozen glazed or a simple dozen assorted. So unless you have
Nice.
unless there's a specific, what is your choice? So what is your order? Do you have a particular donut, or are you just
Yes.
OG?
I'm getting glazed, I'm getting some jelly, and I'm getting some chocolate frosted. That's pretty much it. But I mean, I'd get, as long as they're hot. When they used to be at the Mall of America, I used to go to the Mall of America and just press my nose up against the window and just watch that conveyor belt just go. I could I loved it. It was great.
Well,
God, love
I
it.
expect that we're going to bring the kiddo up there soon to watch it in action. He's a big donut fan, but
Oh, that's great.
we'll keep you updated on that as well. Something that I
Positive
would
news, though.
is
Big
it?
positive news.
Is it?
Go ahead. For me, it is.
I
For
was
me, it
hoping
is.
we could glaze over this, pun intended. But a very big week for Michael Brodkorb. You have taken the lead in our Pick'ems League.
I've taken the lead. I am in the lead.
You are tied for first with Ben Golnick, who has been at the top the whole time. You are officially 4 points ahead of me this week.
It's happening. It's happening. It's happening.
But can we talk about one thing? It
Go ahead.
happened at the betrayal of the Minnesota Vikings.
Yes, it did.
You shunned me. You shamed me so much that I chose the Vikings this week.
Yes. My plan worked out perfectly. I am
not pleased.
So I've discussed on air multiple times that I always pick the Vikings. I realized that I needed to make the type of just calculated decision that I did.
The 1 week I don't flip on them.
So I picked the Vikings to lose against the Ravens on Sunday, and I was there, and I'd actually forgotten about it until you had texted, and I felt very good about the decision. I think the Vikings. I mean, my family's been season ticket holders since '61. I can take 1 week off to make sure that I win, and oh boy, did I need those points. You of course laid out your strategy. Now I've been working on this for a few weeks, and it finally paid off.
There's a lot of season left. I expect to come through, so.
I have the utmost faith that I will continue to succeed, as I am in my family league. But at least you made it a race. Don't give up yet, Becky. There's still hope. But one more time? How many is my lead over you?
4 points. Move on.
Those are 4 games. MoveOn.org. Becky, I want to thank you for making time to do this again this week. I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us on this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before you go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also follow us on our website and across all social media platforms at @BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will be back next week. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.